Good afternoon. Thank you guys for coming. So yes, I am Dr. Jill Soderstrom. I am with Land O'Lakes and Purina. We are the same company. And today I wanted to talk to you guys, really talk to the producers and the calf managers here about gut health technologies. I think a few years back we used to talk about picking the right one, and I think now we're at a day and age where there are a lot of the right ones. And so when I work with our sales team, now they're coming to me and saying, there are so many options out there. Now, how do I select between all of these options? And so I want to talk about kind of that Goldilocks approach of finding not too much, not too little, and finding the right balance of gut health technologies that can help support our calves. So to cover this, I'm going to start with kind of first the idea of just the big picture of helping guide you guys through how do I pick what technologies are right for my system. And part of that is acknowledging that all of you have very unique systems. And so I'm going to kind of build some questions that might help you answer what's going on my specific farm with my specific calves, and then what solutions do I need for my specific area. So we're going to start with the cost of the immune system. So what is the potential problem, and then kind of how big is that problem on your farm or not? Then we're going to do what technologies can help. We're going to go over some of these technologies on a very big scale, these prebiotics, these probiotics, and what in general they're doing or potentially doing for our calf. And then we're going to talk about supporting versus stimulating the immune system. So if we're talking about keeping our calves healthy, we're going to talk about the cost of an immune system. What's the right balance? Again, that Goldilocks approach. What's the right balance of supporting our immune system without overstimulating it? And then the final one's going to be compatibility. I think this is a really important topic, especially now. As I said, there are so many options out there and a lot of good options, but we really now need to start thinking about the compatibility of these options because we're starting to combine multiple different things in our calf, and we need to make sure that they're going to work together well. So to start, the cost of the immune system. What is the potential problem that our immune system is causing our calves? So I'm going to talk about immune activation. So when we think about immune activation, think about the difference of our military that's doing nothing. So it's there, it's costing a little bit of money, there's people involved, there's still equipment, versus when we go to war, when we have to buy new tanks, when we have to bring in more people. That change of that active immune system is where this cost is, and I want to kind of go through how big that cost might actually be in our calves. So when we talk about immune activation, the things that might be activating the immune system are all sorts of things going on in our calves that happen on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't necessarily mean we're doing something wrong when our calves are experiencing this activated immune system. Simple things like castration, sometimes unfortunate injuries, even things like heat or cold stress. I know it was snowing a couple days ago here in Colorado. Now it's pretty warm, these temperature swings. Vaccinations, while they're good, they do still stimulate that immune system. We know a lot of these calves are on trucks these days. Those kind of things, pen moves, all of these things can potentially activate our immune system. So this is part of it. How much is happening to my calves and how much of this is impacting that immune system? So the cost, so when I say cost, I'm thinking about calories, energy, the energetic cost for that immune system to work. So the immune system, unfortunately, is kind of this big spiraling mess. It does a lot of good, but it takes up a lot of energy. To start with, one of the first things that happens when our immune system gets activated is often kind of in our brain. We start to have a fever response stimulated by our brain. And if you think of when you're cold and you want to warm up and to create heat, that takes energy. It takes energy to move around and make heat. So to create a fever, that takes energy from your body. But ironically, at the same time, our brain is also telling us to stop eating. We often see these calves are going to have anorexia. They're off feed. And so now we have a calf that, whether we're talking about our replacement heifers or these crossbred animals, all of these calves, our goal is to grow them. But now we have an animal that is not eating, so it's not intaking the calories that we wanted it to have. And then within that calf, and we think down to the gut level. Normally, we have our blood flowing, our blood goes to our gut. Part of what that's doing is the blood is delivering nutrients in and out of our gut. Some of it is also moving oxygen around to help keep our gut tissue healthy. But when we have an immune response, a lot of our immune cells, so think of where your lymph nodes are, think of if we're talking about an injury, that blood has to go to those other sites, those immune sites, and it has to work on supporting that immune system in that way. And that means there's not blood going to our gut. And if we have less blood going to our gut, then we're not supporting that tissue. And this is one of the reasons we get leaky gut. We're not having enough oxygen going to that tissue, we're not having enough nutrients going to support that tissue, and then we actually cause gut damage. So now we have an animal who's probably not eating, and an animal who that little bit of nutrients they are eating might not be getting absorbed well because their gut tissue is now damaged. Unfortunately, at this point, it just keeps getting worse. Part of that immune system is that the immune system will take energy no matter if the calf has it to give up. The immune system will flip a switch and say, I need that glucose, and so now the calf will have a lower insulin resistance. That calf will not take that glucose and absorb it into the body where we want it to be growing muscle. It will also tell that calf, I need some of that fat as a nutrient source. You don't get to put that fat on your body. I need it to support the immune system. So the immune system is stealing these energy sources from our animals. They're stealing protein and they're stealing fat. And the final one is that our liver as well has to start creating some proteins that are going to be our immune cells. So we talked about the difference of kind of just our low level, army or military out there, and now we're going to war. So we have to recruit more cells that are gonna help us fight these problems. So some of these cells are what we call acute phase proteins. So if you kind of just really basically think of that, so acute phase is that first phase of the response of our immune system. So it just means in the beginning. And then protein, well, it means they're made of proteins. So to make little cells that are made of proteins, we have to have a protein source. So one of the things that I don't think we talk about enough when we talk about sick calves and calves that are having an immune response is how much protein is being used by that sick animal. So these little acute phase proteins, I think, are something I really want to kind of give an idea of how much we're using. So when we look at our muscle cells, so remember again, we're all talking about growing an animal. We want our young baby calf to grow to either be that nice replacement or that nice crossbred animal. But now we have this baby calf that we're trying to feed and we're trying to put muscle protein on, and then she gets sick, and her liver says, I have to make these acute phase proteins. I have to. This is how we will fight off whatever we're dealing with. But the problem is, when we think about proteins, remember they're made up of building blocks. Those building blocks are little pieces of amino acids. And the difference of the amino acids that are in our muscle protein versus the amino acids that build these acute phase proteins is very different. So when you look at the little blue dots here, those are actually limiting amino acids. Those are a group of amino acids that are not commonly found in our muscle protein. So when we have to make a whole bunch of these acute phase proteins, what happens is we have to take almost 4 times the amount of muscle tissue off of our body to break that down to get enough of those specific amino acids to build those acute phase proteins. So it's really an inefficient process. But again, that immune system will do whatever it takes. So if it needs to build those acute phase proteins, it will take it off of our muscle tissue if it's not getting it, enough of it through nutrient absorption. And again, we talked about that calf might not be eating, that calf may have leaky gut, so what we are trying to feed it may not be enough. Another part of this puzzle is glucose. This is a little bit more common, but we all know that our immune system takes a lot of glucose as well. Again, to show just how much glucose our immune system is robbing, I'm gonna give an example with adult cows. I think the numbers just make it really a lot more clear about how much energy can go to the immune system. So there's a study that was done that looked at heat-stressed cows. So this is actually an older study. It's one of the very foundational studies to look at the impacts of heat stress on our lactating dairy cows. What this group did is they took two groups of cows. One group they put in a heat-stressed environment. So those cows were hot every single day. They monitored how much decrease in dry matter intake those cows had. And then they took another group that was in a comfortable thermoneutral zone. So kind of think of a room like this. They were very comfortable, and they reduced their food intake. So they did what's called pair feeding. So they chose to limit that so that both groups had a dry matter intake reduction of about 37%. So two groups eating the same, a reduction from what they normally would. One group is hot, one group is not hot. And then they said, okay, what does this do to milk production? They looked at the milk production of those same two groups. And again, that heat-stressed group is going to be that bottom dotted line. So we expected, yes, these cows are eating less. Of course, we'll see less milk production. But the problem was that the cows that were not heat-stressed and also ate 37% less had only half the difference of that reduction in milk production. So this led to one of those fundamental questions. Where is the other 50% of those nutrients going if they're not being lost all in milk production? Same dry matter intake, but a different reduction in milk production. So what is leaking in that system? Where between what the cow eats and the milk production, where is energy missing? And this study found that that was the immune system. There's been a lot of other work now that has confirmed that the immune system of actually all animals, so you and me, our baby calves, our adult cows, everything in between, we all use the same amount of glucose when our immune system is fully activated. You don't have to remember this. It's a very complicated math, but to make it simple, that means that our adult lactating dairy cow will use about 3.5, almost 4 pounds of just glucose every day when she has an activated immune system. So that very heat-stressed animal is going to use almost 4 pounds of glucose a day. So when we go back to say, well, why did those animals that were heat-stressed as they were reducing their intake, why did their milk production go down? Because it takes about 7 to 8 pounds of glucose to make 110 pounds of milk. So if half of that is going to the immune system, I think it makes sense why we can see some pretty significant reductions in milk production when the immune system is robbing that energy. So getting back to calves, because that's why we're all here, if we math this out for a 100-pound calf, our little baby newborn calf, on that same body weight equation, that calf is using almost half a pound of glucose a day. So if we want to think of this in milk replacer, let's say we're feeding 1 pound of a milk replacer. Let's go with a 20-20, easy math. So 20% fat, 20% protein. So that means 60% of our milk replacer is going to be carbohydrates. Less than half of that is going to be just glucose. So we're now talking maybe about 1/4 of a pound of milk replacer provides 1/4 pound of glucose. So we need at least 2 pounds of milk replacer to make enough glucose just to feed the immune system. That's meaning that none of that is left over to grow our animal. So we are trying to grow an animal, and if we have this activated immune system, we might not be growing our animal. And some of you might be a little skeptical and say, this lady's crazy, she doesn't know what she's talking about, but I'm going to show you what happens. And you might all look back and say that you have seen this happen. So let's talk about, in real life, that energy demand of our immune response. So there was a trial done in Cornell, and they took a group of newborn baby calves, and they give them a very high dose of crypto. If any of you have experienced crypto, you know that it makes calves very sick. They gave calves a very, very high dose because they wanted to make sure that every calf was sick. What they did was they took newborn baby calves, they gave them their typical colostrum at day 1, At day 3, they inoculated every single calf with this high dose of crypto. If you're not quite familiar with the crypto, kind of the phase, at day 7, we're gonna kind of start seeing that onset of shedding. So that's when we're gonna really see those animals start to get sick. At day 11, we're gonna see that peak of shedding. So that's where our animals are gonna be the most sick. Crypto does tend to resolve by itself. And so when we follow these calves out to day 21, we're expecting that they have all recovered at this point from the crypto. The only difference in the 2 groups of calves was the kind of plane of nutrition they fed these babies. So they fed one group of these calves 1 pound of a 20/20. The other group, they fed a high plane of nutrition. They fed 2.5 pounds of a 28/20. That was the only difference. All of the calves were made to be sick. And what is the impact of giving these calves more nutrition? So they looked at, first, pack cell volume. So pack cell volume shows how hydrated our calf is. It's kind of, at least to me, it's a little counterintuitive. You want a lower number. Lower number means more hydrated. The control calves, so the calves that only got 1 pound of that milk replacer, they were in essentially a state of dehydration for that entire 21 days. Whereas our calves that received the 2.5 pounds of milk replacer, they were able to stay in a state of hydration for almost the entire phase. Even when you consider, if you follow that arch, that's where we're gonna hit that peak. So that's gonna be our real key phase of when our calves were the most sick. These calves did get electrolytes because they were scouring quite bad. But you can see just the difference of feeding these calves a higher plane of nutrition and supporting that immune system helped them recover. We also saw, and it kind of makes sense with this correlation, we saw that the fecal scores improved 10 times faster. So not giving them any medication, nothing in the sense that it was actually fighting off the issue they were having, just supporting the immune system and giving food to both the calf and the nutrition to that immune system as it was fighting. And now let's go back to that math that if anybody, I'm not gonna ask who thinks I'm crazy, but the calves that only got 1 pound of that milk replacer lost weight every single day. Their average daily gain was negative 0.1 over the entire period, which means at day 21, those calves weighed less than the day they were born. So that's where all that nutrition went. Every single bit of that milk replacer they ate went to supporting their immune system, and even that 1 pound wasn't enough to support the immune system to the extent that it took muscle and fat off of the body of that newborn baby calf, because that's how much the immune system will take whatever it needs. Whereas we can see that those calves that got that full 2.5 pounds of milk replacer, if any of you are kind of do out the math, that's not a great rate of gain for calves getting that plane of nutrition. But when you compare to how sick these calves were, that means that that was enough to support the immune system as well as keep maintaining and feeding them. We know the importance of average daily gain in these first few weeks of their life has long-term impacts. I don't think that you want a system where your calves are having a negative average daily gain for the first 21 days of their life. The immune system has the potential to really rob these calves. So that first question, when you're thinking on your farm, what is right for my animals? So the first question is, what kind of stress do your animals deal with? So I'm gonna tell you, all of you are gonna say, yes, my calves deal with some stress. It doesn't make you bad producers. All of our animals deal with stress. I deal with stress. My computer did not want to transfer the file today. We all deal with stress. So let's not ignore that none of these calves have stress. So, but how much stress? Are you putting calves on truck for 12, 16 hours? Some of us have to do that. That's going to be a little more stressful. Do you live somewhere where it gets really hot, really cold? There's only so much we can do. That is stressful. So how much stress? Or maybe you have a facility where your calves are still raised on your farm. Your animals aren't transporting that far. Maybe you are a lower stress, but I would still consider that there's still gonna be some stress in your facility. So what about technologies? What technologies When I'm saying, oh, this Goldilocks, what's the right balance? What are the technologies I'm talking about? So again, let's remember this. Let's remember that cost when we go into thinking about one of the first things is reducing this cost. We want to find technologies that reduce the cost of this immune system by preventing this negative spiral. And two of the things that I think are going to be the most impactful and are most common probably to you guys are going to be our prebiotics and our probiotics. And I always talk about these together because they are sympathetic and they go together. So our prebiotics, these are going to be things you'll hear called yeast cultures, moss, beta-glucans, FOS. In general, these tend to be components mostly of yeast, and they are not live organisms. So our prebiotics in general, they have a lot of uses we'll dive into in a minute here, but in general they're going to be food for our good bacteria, and they also can be used to support our immune system. Our probiotics are going to be things that we also might call DFMs or direct fed microbials. Mostly when we're talking about our baby calves, we're talking about live bacteria. Yeast does count as a probiotic. It is a live organism, but we tend not to feed live yeast because it has more of a rumen impact, and we don't tend to feed that as much to our baby calves. But in general, when we're talking about our probiotics, we're thinking of things that are going to help improve nutrient utilization and also support our immune function. And the reason I always talk about these hand in hand is because they function in a way that works together. So if you think about, if you buy a house and you have a nice pond in your backyard, and you say, you know what, I want to put a live organism in that pond. I want to plant fish in my pond. You're going to select a very specific live organism that will work in that system. That's the same thing what we're doing with our probiotic. We are picking a live organism that will work in our system. You're gonna pick a different fish. You might pick a koi if you have a nice, in-ground pond. You might pick carp if you've got a big giant pond, but you might pick different fish if you have a saltwater tank in your house. Different organisms are gonna have a different, the right one for different spaces. So depending on, you have your pond, your fish tank, whatever it is, you've picked your live organism. Well, now we have to support that live organism. So if you have a fish tank with that salt water inside, you have to make sure that that water stays at the appropriate salt levels. And then you also have to feed those fish the appropriate feed. And that's going to be a very different kind of support than if you picked these goldfish or koi for a backyard pond. It's going to be totally different if you have a very large pond with things like carp. You're going to treat that water and that environment differently, and you're going to feed these animals differently. So when we think about selecting our live organism or a probiotic, we need to think about picking a very specific prebiotic that's going to support that live organism. And so kind of going down this, like, how do we pick this? When I'm talking about probiotics, what I'm talking about is selecting a strain that is appropriate for our calves. So I think everybody here will understand this one. I'm gonna start with cows to make this a really easy example. If we talk about species, we can talk about a Bos taurus and a Bos indicus. A Bos taurus example would be a Holstein. A Bos indicus would be a Brahma. I think everybody here, those are very different animals. I would have yet to see anybody milking Bos indicus or a Brahma. They are not known to be a milking breed. I think everybody here, okay, we understand these are very different animals. So let's go down, again, species. Let's keep on the same species now. And now we're gonna go down to strain. So strain is kind of the same as breed. If we're talking the strain of bacteria, the breed of cattle, same concept. So here we go again. So now we're Bos taurus, Holstein. Bos taurus, Belgian blue. Belgian blue are also not a breed I have ever seen on a dairy farm, except now with crossbreds, but not as a dairy replacement animal. Bos taurus, Jersey. Okay, these animals are more similar. Our Holstein and our Jersey are more similar, but everybody now here could tell me the difference between a Holstein and a Jersey. There's a lot of differences between them because strain matters, breed matters, and strain matters. So let me show you where this applies in our bacteria. So Bacillus subtilis. If any of you here work with calves, if you work on a farm or a ranch with cattle, I guarantee somebody has come to your farm and says, I have a Bacillus subtilis for you. And they probably do, because it's a very common strain of bacteria. But what we need to start asking is, what strain do you have, and how is that going to impact my calves? So at Land O'Lakes, we have a strain that we very cleverly call LOL Bacillus, but it is a very specific strain that we use specifically for cattle. There is a strain of Bacillus subtilis called G1, and it causes mold on bread, and it would do absolutely nothing if you fed it to your calves. So the strain of probiotic matters to our calves. On the flip side, when we're talking about this microbiome and the gut population, the strain of pathogens we're talking about also matters. So when we think about talking about, oh, this probiotic might help me against this strain of pathogen, it's important that we're talking about pathogenic strains that impact our calves. So salmonella, everybody, oh, we say salmonella. Oh no, that's not great. Sometimes it's really not great. Salmonella Heidelberg. This is a very bad pathogen to have on your farm if you have calves. None of us want Heidelberg on our farm. But what if we're talking about Salmonella infantis? If your calves had this, if you got a postmortem back with infantis, that would not be what made your calves sick. If you also have poultry on your farm, you'd be concerned because infantis has the potential to make chickens sick. It will not make your calves sick. So we need to make sure when we're talking about what good bacteria we're adding, we also need to make sure we're talking about fighting very specific bad bacteria that is actually going to be pathogenic to our calves. So paying attention to strain of these bacteria is very important. And so again, when we're kind of thinking about this compatibility, these prebiotics work well with our probiotics, we need to remember that our probiotics are not the same. Some of them live in different environments. We talked about those different fish. We know that there's some fish that like to live on the top of the water. There's some fish that are bottom feeders. Our probiotics, our good bacteria, are the same. They live in different niches in our gut. And so when we're selecting specific probiotics to add to our gut environment, we need to think about what food that specific type of bacteria likes. Because depending on which one we select, it might like a different prebiotic. And likewise, we also need to think about that byproduct. What is that probiotic strain going to do? There are probiotics out there that are starting to develop that help break down methane. That would be great in your lactating dairy cattle. I don't think that's something that we need to worry about in our young animals. So the byproduct, what they're producing, varies differently. And again, making sure it's specific to our facility, the problems you have, and a solution that will actually bring a benefit to you. So that second question, so we've already decided, okay, on my own farm, I've decided how much stress my animals are having, so how big of a problem this is. So then we're gonna think, okay, with these probiotics, what is the research on this strain? So please don't come to me saying, I have a Bacillus subtilis, and it's going to cure your salmonella, because none of those address strain. Have you done research on your strain of bacteria and on strains of pathogens that are impacting my calves? And that's the most important thing. On calves, there are strains of bacteria that work well in the ruminant of our adult animal. If we're looking at our 2-day-old baby, a strain that is ruminant predominant may not be right for our calves. A strain that is for chicken and pigs, they might work, but they might not. We have to have tested them in cattle, tested them in calves to make sure that these strains are appropriate for our calves. So back to these prebiotics. If all you remember from this part is that it's complicated, that's great, because it is complicated. And this isn't something you have to know yourself when you leave here, but this is something when somebody says, I have a solution for your farm, you need to ask them these questions, and they should know these answers, and they should be able to explain how these specific products are going to be appropriate for your farm. So if we look at a yeast cells are real tiny little guys. If we pull out the inside of that, we get a product called yeast extract. If we then take just the wall of that yeast, we can break it down, and it's an incredibly complicated system. Whoops. We can break it down even more, and you'll see that each of those little components, so those little orange squiggly guys, those are going to be our MOS, or our mannoliposaccharides. The blue little curves there, those are our beta-glucans. We can even pull those apart and feed those separately, or we can feed the product as a whole entire yeast cell wall. So there's a lot of different options, and they all have different functions in your calves. So if somebody just says, I have a prebiotic that'll work for you, start asking them, well, what component is it, and what is going to be the benefit? So what component is this, and what is the source? And then what are the intended expectations? What am I going to get out of this? How is it going to make a difference in my calf? So let's go now to that support versus stimulate and kind of dive into some of these prebiotics and how we need to find the right balance of these. This is where we get into that potential of the possibly too much. Maybe. So one of these things we talked about, prebiotics can be food for our beneficial bacteria. So FOS is commonly considered food for our bacteria. And so we're going to go back to this fish analogy. We're going to think of, at this point, we have one little goldfish in a tank at home. So we kind of can think of that environment, and we're going to talk about adding a prebiotic. So this prebiotic is, again, going to support that environment. So our prebiotic can help feed that fish, but if we give it too much, we can create a problem. So our prebiotic is going to feed our fish, and then we talked about our fish or our probiotic, that live organism, is going to produce other things. So they ferment that feed that we give them. Some of these things are going to be gases, like carbon dioxide or methane. So it's really important that we find the right balance of feeding our probiotics, feeding our live organisms, that just enough that we're not creating an issue and we're not giving them too much of a good thing. So finding the right balance is very important of not overdoing this. Likewise, again, thinking about going back to this energy source and thinking about these acute phase proteins and them as an energy source. So these acute phase proteins are very important. They are part of the signaling that tells our immune system what needs to happen. It'll tell it that it's seeing a salmonella that it needs to fight, or that it's seeing an injury. So they're very important communicators. But again, it's important to have the right balance. So we all have heard that the idea of our calf is born with this naive immune system. So it's an untrained immune system that doesn't really know right from wrong, self from a problem. So it's the equivalent of having a bodyguard that has no idea what its job is. A bodyguard who has never been trained. That bodyguard is not going to be effective when there is a problem. Just like our immune system, our baby calf has this naive immune system, and so when it sees its first insult, so when the first E. coli comes into contact with that immune system, it takes a long time. That immune system says, I'm not sure what I'm doing, and it's a really slow response. So what we can do is we can add some of these things like beta-glucans. Again, beta-glucan is part of that yeast cell wall, part of that yeast component. We can add a beta-glucan to our calves, and what that does is it shows these immune cells. It says, hey, I'm going to help train you just a little bit. So what we see when we do that is we do actually see a small immune response in the early days, and then our immune system should settle down. And then when we see a pathogen like that E. coli or salmonella, that immune system is now trained. It is now trained and prepared and ready. So right when that immune system encounters a pathogen, it's faster and able to respond more efficiently. So we're able to fight off those pathogens quicker. But again, we talked about there's that risk of too much. So this is where, when we're talking about that Goldilocks, There's a possibility to not support our calves enough, but there is a chance of overstimulating. Something like a beta-glucan, if we overstimulate, and it's kind of like having that same bodyguard that instead of just having him trained so he's prepared, it's like giving him steroids and he kind of hulks out and he's so focused on just rage that he also doesn't do his job. He's wasting energy just being frustrated and mad because we overstimulated him. So these technologies, there is a just right. There is an amount that stimulates in a good way, but not overstimulates. We just want to support this immune system. So that final question, I think one of the things that's really important is talking about dose. Go back to thinking of that first question. What calves are we talking about? Are we talking about addressing problems with calves that just got off a truck for 16 hours and we know they're stressed and they've been commingled and we have a potential problem? Or are we talking about a farm where your calves moved 10 feet over and they get a lot of attention and things are pretty good and you just kind of want to give them that extra boost? What animals are we talking about? Because our technologies are going to work different in those animals. So when somebody says, I have a solution for you, is this a solution for high-stressed animals that are already having immune complications? Or is this a solution that I should be feeding my calf every day during that milk phase because it's just going to help support them and be more preventative in case something bad happens? So understanding the right dose for the right type of system your calves are in is very important. And the final one is technology compatibility. So we already talked about prebiotic and probiotics, and I'm sure most of you know there's a lot of other ones out there. And there's also the combination of prebiotics and probiotics. But other things like our phytogens and different sources that our calf might all be seeing at one time. This paper was recently published in the journal Dairy Science. I feel like I need to send them a thank you note because, spoiler alert, they got bad results. And most of us don't publish things when we get bad results. But this paper is a great example of that not everything works with compatibility. So what this team did is they looked at 2 products. Like I said, there are a lot of good options out there. They looked at a commercially available botanical extract. It has been proven in calves, so it checks my first box. It's been proven in calves to help enhance dry matter intake and gut health. And they looked at a second product from a very different company, and they said, in calves, this has been shown to improve gut health and improve growth and performance. So right there, they said, check, check. Both of these sound great. Different mode of action. Let's put these together in our calf, and we hope we're going to see a synergistic impact. We're going to get 1 + 1 = 2. Maybe 1 + 1 = 3. That'd be great. It can happen. But unfortunately, what they got was 1 + 1 = -2. So they looked at each of these individually, which was great because they did show that indeed they actually did have an increase over the control. Not maybe as significant as they were expecting, but on an individual basis, both of these technologies worked well. When they combined the technologies together and fed these calves, they saw that here we're showing that dry matter intake was reduced for the entire phase of 10 weeks of feeding these animals, these 2 technologies. And you're saying, okay, well, cross my fingers, maybe they were more efficient. Nope. The combination of these products, these calves actually had a reduction in body weight compared to the control and compared to when each individual technology was fed together. So for some reason, these 2 technologies, when fed together, had an antagonistic impact. These calves would have been better off without any added technologies than compared to the combination of these 2 technologies. And we don't know if technologies are going to work together until we test them in the animal, and the animal shows us that they either do or do not work together. The second one is bacteria compatibility, and I think this is a very hot topic of, do I feed one strain of bacteria? Should I be feeding a combination strain of bacteria? I'm going to tell you, I think there's not a clear answer, But if we start talking about feeding combinations of bacteria, it is incredibly important that we're making sure that these bacteria play nice together. So one thing when we want to test a bacteria, one of the first things we do is we'll look at something called a zone of inhibition. So we take a Petri plate and we smear it with a bad bacteria. And hopefully the research is done on a strain that we know is impactful to calves. And then inside those little black wells, we're going to put our good probiotic bacteria. And ideally, if that probiotic is impactful against this pathogenic bacteria, we get that zone of inhibition. So that clear spot means that the good bacteria prevented growth of the bad bacteria. So when we look at, is this bacteria going to be impactful in my calves, we're going to look at this zone of inhibition. So here's an example where we had a customer who was asking us, they said, we're really interested, we have a lot of salmonella and a lot of clostridial. Can we put a couple bacteria together and make a product that is going to benefit our calves? So at Land O'Lakes, we have this large library of different bacteria. And so we took a bunch that on paper say they should work against Clostridium and work against salmonella. And we got a strain of Clostridium perfringens that was isolated from sick calves. So we know that it was a strain that does impact calves. And we looked at a handful of different bacteria and we looked at their zone of inhibition. We said, okay, so here's our top 6. So we selected these, said, okay, next step, we want to look at that salmonella. Again, we made sure to pick salmonella strains that were directly from sick calves. We knew that these were problematic strains, so if we're going to test if this is going to help calves, let's make sure we're looking at the right strains. So we looked at a couple individually. We said, okay, we're finding some good ones here. We said, but we have a lot of problems here, so we wanted to use at least 2 different strains. We want to make sure we have broad spectrum protection for these animals that we're looking at. So if you notice, at the very top there, it shows that 50/50 and BC39 were both quite effective against all salmonellas. Then we put them together, and they stopped doing anything. They were not effective. And this is common. Bacillus subtilis, while it can be beneficial, sometimes you put it next to each other, and all it does is it wants to compete and fight. So this showed us that would probably not be the best strain combination for our calves. Individually, those are both good products, but when we combine them, for some reason, we do not see an impact. In the animal, it might be a little bit different, but when we have other options, as you can see above, when we have other options where side by side they still do their job and they still prevent bacteria growth, that's just some of those combinations that we just say, it's not worth trying, they're probably not going to be our best option. So looking at strain compatibility is very important. And so if we haven't tested multiple strains together, there's a risk that we're going to have those bottom lines where they do not do their actual job. So that final question, really thinking about combining our technologies, have they been tested together? And so this is why, kind of overall, so we're going to start with our question of, are my animals stressed? What stress situations are we having? Do I want a product for really high stress animals or lower stress animals? Then thinking through, what probiotic, what live organism am I trying to grow in there? And then how am I going to support that with these prebiotics? And then now that I'm talking about multiple things, do I have confidence that these all work together? And that's why we always do things with a program approach. Because we know that at the end of the day, all of these technologies and any product you're putting in your calf, at the end of the day, they're all going into the same gut of a single calf. So if we're talking about a technology that we want to feed a calf as maybe a day 1 product, kind of a probiotic booster, energy booster, that's going into the gut. That's going to be the same gut that we're putting milk replacer in. So whatever technologies are in both of those products, we need to pay attention that as a program, those are going to be compatible. And the same as we think of our starter and grower. Our calves start eating that starter a couple days, couple weeks in, so any technologies that we're adding to our starter grain is also going to be mixed in with the same technologies that's in that milk replacer and any other products that we're adding in there. If it's all going to be in the same stomach, we need to think program-wise of these calves. We can't think about individual technologies anymore because, as you saw, sometimes you can combine multiple things that on their own work well, but in combination, if we don't think about this as a holistic approach, we might get either negative or at least not a benefit to our calves. So we really owe it to our calves to kind of find what's just right, finding that right balance of supporting the immune system, supporting that gut health without overdoing it. And with that, I think I have a moment for questions. Thank you for your time.